With Blackmagic's inclusion of Fusion in both the free and paid studio versions of Resolve, the time has arrived for every editor, motion graphics designer, and VFX artist to learn node-based compositing. Fear not, as usual, our survival guide will have you up and running using Fusion inside Resolve in minutes, not days, and our companion guide on the fundamentals of node-based compositing will dispel the mysteries of the whole node workflow. All right, let's go. There are a couple of ways to create a Fusion comp in Resolve. By far the simplest is to move your playhead over a clip in the editor timeline and switch to the Fusion page. A Fusion comp is automatically created, and you'll find a media in input node containing the clip from the editor timeline, and an output node that will send the final result back to the timeline once you've created your effects in Fusion. That's fine for a single clip, but what if you have several clips stacked in the timeline and you want to work with all of them inside of Fusion? Well, in that case, just select the clips, right-click, and choose New Fusion Clip. Resolve collapses the clips down to a single item in the timeline. This time, when you position the playhead over the clip and switch to the Fusion page, you'll find a separate media in node for each of the original clips, merged and connected to the final output node. We'll explain what those merge nodes are doing in a moment. For the sake of simplicity, we'll assume here that you've started with a single clip in the timeline and switched to the Fusion page. To add additional clips to the node view here, simply drag them in from Resolve's media pool. Now there are three main sections to the Fusion page: the two viewers at the top, the main nodes view below it, and the property inspector to the right. You can show and hide the property inspector here. To pan around the node view, hold down the middle mouse button, that typically means pressing in on the scroll wheel, and drag. Don't have a 3-button mouse? Well, there are alternate keyboard shortcuts, but really, it's in your best interest to go out and buy one. To zoom, hold down the left and middle mouse buttons and drag left and right. Or, hold down the middle mouse button and click the left or right mouse buttons to zoom in discrete steps. Now it's completely possible that you middle mouse panned your nodes all the way off the screen and can't see them anymore. Don't panic. A navigator window will appear in the upper right. Just click into it to snap the nodes back to the center of the flow area. This really comes in handy once your node trees grow into dozens of nodes in more complex shots. Fusion automatically wired up our additional media in nodes with merge nodes. But since we want to learn the fundamentals here, let's delete the extra merge nodes by drag selecting through them and pressing the delete key. We'll add our own merge nodes in just a moment. The names Media in 1, Media in 2, 3, 4, 5 aren't particularly helpful. To rename a node, select it and press Function key F2. Looking over at the inspector, we can see that this Media in node corresponds to the ground clip. So we'll rename it to ground. We'll do the same to rename the other nodes according to the different video clips they represent. As an additional help, select all the media in nodes, right-click and choose Show Tile Pictures. You may need to load each clip into the viewer to force the tile picture to cache. To load a node into the viewer, select it and press the 1 key to load it into the left viewer, or 2 to load the node into the right viewer. If you have an external broadcast monitor to work with, you'll press 3 to load the node into that monitor. Small LEDs at the bottom of each node indicate whether it's currently loaded into a viewer. You should now have a nice visual indicator thumbnail of exactly what each image clip represents. If a thumbnail doesn't immediately appear for one of the nodes, you may need to shift the timeline playhead to force the cache to update. The timeline below the viewer is automatically set to match the length of the clip in the editing timeline, but if you want to focus on just a section of the clip, you can always change the playback range by entering new numbers to the left. And at right is the frame number at which the playhead is currently parked. You can jump the playhead to a specific frame by typing a number in there. Okay, let's play this thing back. To do so, simply press the play button. First time around, you may see some stuttering as Fusion renders the frames into RAM. Once all the frames are cached, the video should play back smoothly. Use the other playback buttons to stop, play in reverse, and choose whether to play once or loop or ping pong timeline playback. Right-click to choose between looping or ping pong behavior. If you want to adjust the timing of individual clips, Fusion includes a dedicated keyframes view. We'll hide the inspector for now to give us room, and then drag the border to resize the keyframes view. Here, you can shift the start and end of each item separately. Press Ctrl-Z on a PC, Command-Z on a Mac to undo the changes. Let's take a look now at the node view, also called the flow area. First, you can either build your composite trees left to right or top to bottom. Now, a lot of people find node trees easier to conceptualize top-down, and that's how we actually explain things in our Introduction to Node-Based Compositing video. So if you prefer a top-down approach, right-click in an empty section of the flow area and choose Options, Build Flow Vertically. Now in this video, we'll stick to the left to right flow since that's the more common way to work in Resolve. Alright, it's time to learn how to actually build a node tree. To make more space as you work, drag the borderline between the viewers and the node view upwards. Unlike other applications, Fusion always adds new merge nodes to the background input first, so you'll always select the backmost layer initially. In this case, that's the sky clip, since that should be the farthest element from the camera. Now there are several ways to add new nodes. While you're still learning, probably the easiest thing to do is right-click and choose Add Tool. You can then browse through all the categories of nodes, there's a lot of them, to find the one you're looking for. But for now, let's click away to dismiss the right-click menu, because there's a faster way to access nodes if you know what node you're after. Common nodes have shortcuts at the top of the interface, but there's an even faster way still that keeps your mouse pointer in the flow area where all the action is. Make sure your background image is selected and press Shift-Space on your keyboard. The Add Tool window pops up. Now just start typing the first few letters of the tool's name. In this case, it's the Merge tool. Fusion isolates just the nodes that contain those letters and hones in on the best match. Press Enter, and the node gets added to your flow. This might feel a little clunky the first time around, but you'll soon find it takes you a split second to call up the most common nodes. The background input was automatically connected, since we had the sky node selected when we added it. But now we need to connect the foreground layer we want to composite over the top of the sky. We'll drag our next node, the tower node, and position it just above the merge. To connect, just drag from the square output of a node to the foreground input on the merge node. If we now select Merge 1 and press 2 to load it into Viewer 2, we'll now see the Eiffel Tower floating in space. Now, how did we know which input was the foreground and which was the background? Well, a simple way is to mouse over one of the inputs and look at the status bar at lower left. It'll tell you the name of the input you're hovering over. But if you look carefully, you'll notice the arrowheads for the inputs are colored. The position of the input connectors may change to accommodate the layout of the graph, but the colors consistently match their input types. Yellow for background, green for foreground, and light blue for the effect mask. We'll get to that input a little later. The output of a node is represented by a square. If you accidentally wired the foreground into the background, or vice versa, just press Ctrl-T on Windows, Command-T on a Mac, with the node selected, and Fusion will automatically swap the inputs for you. And if you want to disconnect a pipe between nodes, just double-click it, or drag the input portion away from the node it's connecting to. As always, Ctrl-Z on a PC, Command-Z on a Mac will undo. Notice that we've positioned the merge just to the right of the initial sky clip with the tower clip directly above it. This is a good way to keep your sanity when compositing left to right. Create one master horizontal pipe of merges with new elements being added to it from above or below. Let's add our ground element. Making sure the merge we just added is selected, we'll press Shift-Space to add another merge. An added bonus when using the Shift-Space tool picker is that it'll remember your last selection. So if you're adding the same node again, you can simply press Enter. Handy when you're wiring up a bunch of nodes with merges. We'll connect ground to the foreground input of the new merge, and then repeat the process for the UFO. But this time, we'll simply copy and paste a merge node using the typical Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, or Command-C, Command-V, copy and paste shortcuts. We'll select the final merge and press 2 to see the full shot composited into Viewer 2. Lastly, we need to remember to connect the Media Out node to the end of our composite so that the result of all our work can make its way back to the Resolve Edit page and then onward to color correction. Right now, the UFO isn't casting a shadow on the ground, something we need to correct if we want to make the shot more believable. We'll select the ground node and add a color corrector node using the tool picker. We can then drag the gain slider down to plunge our entire farmyard into shadow. Of course, we want to limit the shadow to the area where the UFO would obstruct the skylight from reaching the ground. That's where a node's mask input comes in. We have a special shadow pass that was created by the 3D renderer along with the UFO. If we connect the shadow mat to the blue mask input of the color corrector, we now have a correct shadow that we can darken or brighten using the gain slider in the inspector. To see the difference, we can temporarily disable a node by selecting it and pressing Ctrl-P for pause on Windows, Command-P on a Mac. Let's quickly talk about the display view options. Both views are identical in function. They just provide room to view different elements in your comp at the same time. Navigating in the viewer is conveniently identical to navigating in the node view. Middle mouse to pan, left and middle mouse drag to zoom. To squeeze everything back to fit in the viewer, press Ctrl or Command F. And to zoom to 100 or 200%, press Ctrl or Command 1 and 2, respectively. At the top of each display view is a row of buttons. At the far right is a general list of options. The first of these is Show Controls. For nodes that have on-screen controls, like this merge node that has transform controls, this option can temporarily hide the controls for a better view of the current composition. Now, we recommend against this while learning, however, since forgetting you've turned it off can create a world of confusion later. Instead, either click in the gray space to deselect the node or select another node without associated on-screen controls, like this Media In node. Next on this list is the Checker Underlay. Deselect this to disable the Photoshop-like transparency display, replacing it with black. For a lot of elements with transparency, this actually makes it a lot easier to visualize the image accurately. Then we have Show Pixel Grid when zoomed in, and Smooth Resize, which, when disabled, will show exact square pixels instead of OpenGL interpolated smooth ones. Following that is the option to display gamma and gain sliders, useful for identifying issues in the highlights and shadows beyond the dynamic range of your monitor. Notice, as with all controls in Fusion, clicking the small dot underneath a slider will reset it back to its default value. Finally, there's a menu option for interpreting 360 image formats when working with 360 video and VR headsets. Following this is a button to collapse to a single viewer if desired, which then brings us to perhaps the most important menu for the viewers, the Viewer LUT. Now this requires a little bit of a detour into color management. There are many ways to set up color management in Resolve, so we're just going to focus on a single reliable recommendation. In Project Settings, start by setting the color science to DaVinci Color Managed. Set the input space to the color space of your main source footage. If you're working with computer graphics files like TIFFs and PNGs, this will be sRGB. If you're working with broadcast video, it'll probably be Rec. 709. Now set the timeline space to linear and the output space to whatever you want your final files to be output as. Typically sRGB for web work, Rec. 709 for video, and a variety of other spaces for film work. Now back on the Fusion page, in the viewer, choose a LUT that matches your display. Here we're working with a standard sRGB computer monitor, so we'll choose a LUT that moves us from the linear timeline space to sRGB. This means that Fusion will apply an sRGB LUT to make things look correct for our computer monitor, but we'll keep a nice linear color space for all the internal mathematics happening under the hood as we composite. Once you've set the LUT option, you'll need to make sure it's enabled via the main LUT button next to the LUT option menu. You'll need to repeat the process and enable the LUT for the other viewer. After the LUT options is a menu to switch the viewer channels, but you'll never actually use it. Instead, hover your mouse over the viewer and press R to look only at the red channel, G for green, B for blue, and A for alpha. Press the last shortcut key again to toggle back to the full color view. Next up, the ROI or Region of Interest button. Choose Set and then drag out a region in the display view. You'll see a thin white rectangle appear in your viewer. So what's the ROI for? Well, once your comps start to get more complex, frames won't render quite as quickly as they are for us now with these simple elements slapped together. Let's quickly add a defocus for demonstration purposes. By enabling Region of Interest, you're telling Fusion only redraw a portion of the viewer. It speeds up rendering and allows you to focus on particular problem areas. Let's delete the defocus and disable ROI again. The Subview button and associated menu enable additional useful overlays like scopes, with the size adjustable via the lower right corner of the subview. Next are the buffer options. Now, each viewer actually holds 2 buffers. Switch to the alternate buffer and then select another node and press its viewer number, here that's viewer 2, to load the new node into the alternate buffer. You can now toggle between the buffers via the menu, or more usefully, the less than and greater than keys. The buffers also allow you to perform wipe and dissolve comparisons. Finally, a zoom menu allows you to select a viewer zoom percentage, or press Ctrl F or Command F to fit the image into the viewer. One thing that often confuses people coming to node-based compositors is how to move elements around the screen. Unlike Photoshop or a nonlinear editor, you can't simply drag something in the viewer. In Fusion, each merge node has transform controls to adjust the incoming foreground element. But alternately, you can add an explicit transform node from the Tools menu. With the transform or merge node selected, you'll see on-screen controls appearing for repositioning and rotating the foreground element. The on-screen controls for the transform appear whenever the transform's parameters are loaded into the inspector. Now we're almost done with our introduction to Fusion. Just one more thing to cover off: animation. At its basic level, it's pretty simple. Just click the keyframe diamond for a parameter to set a key and turn on auto keyframing. Now move anywhere else along the timeline, adjust that parameter again, and it will automatically set another keyframe. Once you have something animated, you can head over to the Spline tab, select the parameter you just animated, and select a point and adjust its tangent handles to create easing motions, add new points by Alt or Option clicking on the curve, and delete points by selecting them and pressing Delete. Or use the Keyframes view with its expandable dope sheet for After Effects style adjustment. One last thing to look at before we wrap: versions. Enable the Clips view and then right-click on the thumbnail representing the current composite. If you select Create New Composite, Fusion duplicates your current comp. Now we can make a radical change to the new comp, and we can use the same right-click menu to select the previous version before we made the changes. Or create a new comp, and then choose Reset Fusion Composition to set it back to the default Media In and Media Out nodes. You can then select between the different versions at will, and they'll be updated back in the timeline and ready to color correct in the color correction page. And that brings our lightning-quick introduction of Blackmagic Fusion to a close. Of course, we haven't even touched the 3D functionality, the particle system, the paint and roto tools, tracking, title animation, network rendering, stereoscopic 3D, and a whole host of other high-end features. But by now, you should have enough knowledge of the application to start creating composites and transitioning the knowledge you've gained in other digital video applications to Fusion inside of Resolve. And if you're new to working with nodes, you owe it to yourself to watch our introduction to node-based compositing next.